All right, credits. Let's go. All right, first things first. The bottom center of the screen. Get there. The bottom center of the screen says that we've beaten 101 games this year. And 423 since we started doing this in 2020. Those numbers are now incorrect. We've now beaten 102 games in 2023 and 424 since we started doing this in 2020. Let's go. All right. So here's I have some thoughts on this game. This is only my second Kirby game. I played Dreamland and now I've played this. And I can see there's a clear path of growth on the game. This is obviously a much bigger, more fleshed out experience than Kirby's Dream Land. Kirby's Dream Land was a blink and you miss it hour-long game that really wasn't difficult at all. I think I died 20-something times during the whole thing. This game rehashes some things, but that doesn't bother me because it seems like more of like a callback thing than just laziness. And yeah, pretty much everything about this game was better. The combat was way better with the ability to be able to take others' abilities. Like, this is the game that came from, apparently, because it wasn't really in Dreamland. You could eat enemies, but you couldn't really absorb their powers. And so that's a really cool mechanic, and this is where that was born, and that's really cool. And it makes the combat a lot more interesting. You know, you can choose your weapon that fits your fighting style, and I really like that. The boss fights were way harder, but they were definitely better, just because they were hard. I mean, they were harder, and sometimes in kind of an unfair way, but usually it was pretty balanced. Obviously, the game looks good. I had no idea this was a Nintendo game that came out in '93. That doesn't make any sense to me. That's like when the later Super Nintendo games were coming out. So why is it? They were still. I didn't even know they were making Nintendo games in 1993. So this is, you know, the best looking Nintendo game there is, pretty much. I really liked the combat. As far as like compared to the original, like there's no comparison. This is a much better game all around. Now, if I think about comparing it to other games, there are a few things that, like when I think about its value to me next to something like Sonic or Mario or Zelda or things like that, there are a couple of things that stand out to me as maybe not so hot. The controls are a little bit clunky for me. Now that could be a me problem. I had trouble with the controls, and I think the reason is that there's so much that you can do in this game. Most games you can run and you can jump, and that's about it. You know, Mario, Sonic. This game, you've got different attacks, multiple different attacks. You can fly. You've got a flying mechanic. And to be able to squish all that down into just a 2-button commands, that makes it where you've got it. If you hit up and B, it does something. If you hit down and B, it does something. If you hit, you know, like that kind of thing. If you, so because of that, it was hard for me to do anything right. I was often doing sliding when I meant to be attacking, or attacking when I meant to be flying, stuff like that. So that was hard for me. So I'm not sure that that's an objective problem, because they did the best they could, and a fairly good job, a really good job, considering the hardware. But it did, the experience did suffer a little bit for me from that, because it was frustrating. The controls were confusing for me. Again, that's probably more a me problem than anything else, but it still was there. I thought the game became a little bit repetitive toward the end. While this is a much more fleshed out game, it doesn't have the scope of something like Super Mario World, but it seemed to me like it's weird that this game came after Super Mario World, even though it's a regular Nintendo game. But it seemed to me like they were trying to do a Super Mario World-esque thing, try and make a really big thing out of this Nintendo game, which is cool, but for me, having all that stuff packed into what is essentially still a pretty basic game, much more basic than something like Super Mario World, it became a little bit repetitive because, yes, it's a much longer experience, but it didn't have the variety of something like Super Mario Bros. 3. And so the levels, most of the levels kind of were the same. You know, you think of like Super Mario Bros. 3, there's a lot of variety in the worlds, right? And this game, there was a little bit more toward the end, but there wasn't as much variety in the world. So it was really like, the game kind of all blended together. It was just one level after another, and most of the levels, to me, were mostly the same. So it got a little bit repetitive. It didn't have the scope or the variety of something like Mario and the later Mario, Nintendo, and early Super Nintendo games, which is around when this came out. Now, I will say that I think I liked this more than Sonic, because Sonic doesn't have that variety, and he also doesn't have the clean platforming of something like Mario. So for me, Sonic's kind of the worst of both worlds, at least the early Sonic games, because I've only played 1 and 2 at this point. So I think I do like this better than Sonic because the combat variety is a lot more interesting. And while it doesn't look as good because it's older hardware, I think the levels were more interesting. I thought the combat was more interesting. The boss fights were way better than Sonic. The boss fights were challenging in this game. Sonic, at least 1 and 2, the boss fights just aren't challenging, not really. So I think, end of the day, not as good as Mario. And I've only played 1 and lost levels at this point, but let's be real, I have picked up a controller to play 3 and Mario World before, although that was 30 years ago and I don't remember it that well, and I never got very far in those games, but I still remember some of what was involved with those games, and I don't think this game meets that standard. I don't think it meets the standard of 1 or 2 either. Just the platforming isn't as clean. It's a little bit more cluttered. So better than Sonic for me. Not as good as Mario. Early games is what we're talking about now. This game probably is going to sit somewhere around Mega Man for me. Mega Man 1 and 2, because I've only played those 2 games, and I think I like this about as much as those. For a lot of the same reasons. It's got a really cool idea. Like, Mega Man 2 had a really great idea where it's like, you kill the boss, you take their powers, and you use those powers to kill other bosses and to beat other levels. This has a very similar mechanic, but it's taken from a whole different perspective, where you can take them right in the middle of levels and kind of change them up on the fly, just taking them from regular enemies, and then use them as you see fit. That's a really cool idea. But like Mega Man, the platforming and the combat is kind of all over the place, and so, you know, it's going to suffer a little bit for that. All in all, to sum up, I quite enjoyed it. I think it's a clear improvement on the original. I'm not sure it quite measures up to the Mario standard that was set in the early to mid 90s, but great effort. I'm very curious to see where the Kirby franchise goes from here. I'm planning to play every major Kirby game in order, so over the next year or so. So I'm curious to know where it goes, but obvious improvement on the first game. Really enjoyed it. Okay. Okay, that's it. So this would be the part of the video normally where I would say, Kirby, it's been fun, but we are now going to delete you from our console and never play you again. But since this is on the Switch, we're not deleting these games, obviously, so we'll just say adieu, and we had fun.